It's my great pleasure to introduce and to welcome to the stage the leader of the Liberal Democrats, Nick Clegg. Thanks. Well, Nick, the first question is from Richard Robinson, who's PPC in East Hampshire, and I'd ask him to stand by if he wishes to ask a supplementary. His question is, much is being said about protecting the defence budget. Do you think that Britain's diplomatic capability should not be overlooked in this debate?
Where are you, Richard? Wherever you are. Yeah, the answer is yes, absolutely. I mean, our influence in the world, of course, is in part dependent on our ability to project military force when that is really absolutely required, but it's by absolutely no means the only manner in which we seek to influence the world around us as an important world power, and that, of course, is important to us in turn as an internationalist party. What we do on development aid is terrifically important. And I think it is a fantastic Liberal Democrat achievement that we've not only delivered 0.7% of our national wealth in development aid to the poorest countries around the world, that we've legislated for it. And Michael Moore deserves a lot of praise for that. But also, as Richard's question implies, how many consulates and embassies and our diplomatic reach around the world, the money that we put into our intelligence services, the money we put into international cybercrime, the money we put into international cooperation against cross-border crime, all of these things add up to our ability and provide us the means to project influence around the world, which is why some of this kind of debate about, if we spend 2% on defence, as we do at the moment, everything's okay, but if we spent 1.9999%, it's all a disaster, is of course totally misleading, because actually how we spend money in all of those different silos is just as important.
Thank you. And does Richard have a supplementary? No? No? So if you want to maybe take a couple of questions.
Yes, all right. Come on.
Defence from the hall?
Anybody related to this? Any questions, comments? Come on, an internationalist party doesn't have a... Yes. Yes, gentleman there. Do you want to just wait for the microphone?
Thank you. Do you think the EU should have an army?
No. Honestly, it's a balmy army idea, and it's.
That's the right answer.
Yes, it is the right answer. I think Jean-Claude Juncker said this week that he thought there should be a European. I think he said it before. So you have sort of Nigel Farage on the one end of the scale saying it's going to happen, and Jean-Claude Juncker on the other end of the scale saying he wants it to happen. They're both, I think, they're both wrong. The only two countries in Europe at the moment, at least, that have any meaningful military capability whatsoever are France and Britain. And if we actually want to do our bit and make sure that Europe doesn't constantly have to go scurrying off to ask Uncle Sam to sort out our problems militarily, and we want to kind of be able to take action ourselves as Europe, is not to create great new armies, it's actually to deliver more bangs for our bucks between France and Britain, and to make sure that our defence procurement policies, the way that we organise ourselves, what kit we buy, how we operate together, can be done more effectively together. That is by far the most useful thing for us to do, rather than invent new armies out of thin air. There you go, Liberal Democrats applauding as I say something that Europe shouldn't do. There's a first. Who else? Yeah.
Wouldn't it be nice to be able to spend as much on development aid as we do on defence?
Well, I think the fact we've got to, as Lindsay here in the front row, who does such brilliant work for us in DFID, will be able to tell you, we lead the world already by committing to 0.7%. That is far, far in excess of what other countries do, and we certainly lead in the world, and the Liberal Democrats have led on this here domestically in putting it into law as well. So, I think we shouldn't sort of do down or belittle the extraordinary achievement by somehow then saying immediately we should do even more. It's a very, very considerable achievement. Yep.
What more do you think we could do to encourage the EU to engage in and support what is happening in Ukraine?
In Ukraine, look, the thing about the EU is, I mean, we just talked about this. I personally don't think the EU should sort of pretend that that it sort of equips itself with the conventional military accoutrements of a nation state. The biggest clout that the European Union has is economic clout. It's why I'm so frustrated that Europe, the European Union, we are an economic giant, superpower in the Middle East, but we act like a political pygmy. We just don't use our collective economic clout effectively enough. And I'm afraid, whilst I think it is a good thing, the way we've applied sanctions against Vladimir Putin, and we continue to do so, and we do so in close cooperation with the Americans, as we should, to show a united front. As Vince will know from his vantage point in the department that administers a lot of these sanctions, it's been, it's a fearfully complicated job to get other countries, and bluntly, particularly those countries in Southeast Europe, who are members of the European Union, who have huge Russian influence exerted upon them. Politically, some of the political parties there are, literally look to the Kremlin for inspiration. All of their energy imports come from Russia, and a lot of their media interests are either directly or by proxies owned by Russian interests. So we have a huge, we have a massive long-term strategic dilemma, it seems to me, which is that if we are entering into a long-term phase of strategic competition rather than cooperation with Russia, I wish it were not the case, but if it certainly looks if we're heading in that direction, then the European Union is really going to have to try and wean itself off some of the ways by which Russia directly and indirectly exercises undue influence over parts of the European Union itself. Most notably, perhaps, the over-reliance on oil and gas imports from Russia. And Ed Davies not here, but Ed has been leading the arguments in the European Union. It's not something you can do overnight, to wean those countries that are presently over-reliant on energy imports from Russia off that reliance. If we do that, then I think the European Union really can exert, not only now, but in the future, real kind of clout in the near, if I can put it, in the sort of near abroad, without sort of indulging in sort of spheres of influence language. But we first need to work out a way in which we can be more self-sufficient, particularly in energy policy.
Thank you. We'll move on to the next question we've had submitted on a different subject. It's from John Drage from Sutton. Given the excellent record of achievement the Liberal Democrats have in government, why are our opinion poll ratings so poor?
Well, if anyone has a perfect answer for that, stick it on a postcard and send it in. And I mean, look, I don't know. I mean, the history books will no doubt, and the students of British politics will analyse this in the future. I guess some of the reasons are obvious. The very act of going into the first proper coalition in living memory is a highly controversial thing to do. If we'd gone into coalition with Labour, it would have been highly controversial with lots of sort of, centre-right voters in the southwest, in the same way that going into coalition with the Conservatives is highly controversial in sort of conservative, anti-conservative parts of the country, whether it's Sheffield or Scotland or elsewhere. I mean, it just, because politics have been so starkly polarised between those two parties, whoever we would have gone into coalition with would have created a great deal of controversy on the other side of the political ledger. That's clearly one reason. On top of that, obviously, the very, very difficult, gory, and in some cases downright unpopular decisions we've had to take to start balancing the books. It's not the clean-up operation that we've had to preside over because of the mess we inherited. It was never going to be a sort of easy or straightforward thing to do. And then, of course, because you've just got the very powerful vested interests from right and left, powerful financial vested interests, the trade unions on the one hand, the sort of hedge funds on the other, you've got the big powerful interests in the press lined up left and right. They both they both abhor Liberal Democrats in government more than they abhor each other. So, because we, I mean, like all vested interests, we are a sort of standing affront to their business model. Their business model is the kind of pendulum swing of pass the parcel, Buggins turn politics. And suddenly we come along, we mess it up, and they hate it. So of course we get yelled at from left and right. And you read the Daily Mirror and the Daily Mail every day, and you'll see what I mean. They are equally vituperative, if from ideologically opposed directions, about us, the Liberal Democrats. So of course that has an effect. But all I would say is, whatever the reason, you can all speculate, there's only one antidote, and that is to proudly and loudly continue to say what we've done and we want to do again in the future. And here's the good news: whatever the national opinion polls are saying, where we do that on the ground, where we can tell our side of the story because no one else will, I tell you, the polls look very, very different, much, much better. We make the weather, and we're going to win. Oh, right, yes. Yeah.
Seems to me, as an originally non-Brit, that the thing that is inspiring about the Liberal Democrats is the word liberal, and the liberal message which distinguishes it significantly from the other parties. And it seems to me that in all this minutiae about the arguments about in particular policies that we're getting hammered on, if we were to emphasize the liberal nature of what we're doing, some of the candidates, some of the PPCs are doing, then we might, if we get that message across, we might be able to make a significant difference. I don't know how to phrase that in terms of a question, but...
Well, it wasn't a question, it was a statement, and a very good one, absolutely. More liberalism, I quite agree, absolutely. Chap there, yep, in the what looks like a waistcoat, yes.
Hello, Richard Flowers, Tower Hamlets. Nick, I'd like to thank you for one of the achievements, which is my marriage.
When did you get married?
That wouldn't have been possible without Liberal Democrats.
When did you get married?
Last October, instead of conference. Sorry. So thank you very much. What achievements have most surprised you that we've managed to do?
That we have done?
Yes.
Most surprised. That's by the way, an excellent excuse not to come to conference, but about the only excuse. Let that not happen again to you. The most surprised. Gosh, that's a. I mean, look, only because it's very uppermost in my mind at the moment, and it's kind of. It was so unfashionable at the beginning, but I think has now caught the public imagination. I am particularly surprised in the best possible way about the public reaction to our achievements on mental health. Shortly after I became leader, 7 odd years ago, one of the first questions I asked the then Prime Minister Gordon Brown was on mental health in Prime Minister's Questions. And I remember the slightly sort of patronising Westminster Village sort of tut-tutting of, oh, what an odd, quirky question to ask. No one cares about it in politics, kind of thing. And now, I've just announced on your behalf, this morning, the biggest overhaul and transformation of child and adolescent mental health services, probably in the post-war period. We're going to announce in the budget on Wednesday £1.25 billion to transform children and adolescent mental health services, which has been a criminally abandoned and under-resourced part of our health service for far, far too long. It'll benefit 110,000 children. Can you imagine? It is estimated on average in every classroom there will be 3 children who have mental health issues which are not being properly treated. And then, all the stuff that Norman Lamb has done to introduce access and waiting time standards for mental health, which didn't exist before, the money going in to improve talking therapies, the huge £150 million we're now putting into transform help given to people with eating disorders. I mean, anorexia, particularly but not exclusively for teenage girls, is the biggest mental health killer in this country, and we're doing something about it. Now, So that's the thing that has probably surprised me most in there, because when I sort of started going on about this at the beginning, many years ago, it really was a bit of a sort of hidden debate in politics. It's now become an issue of mainstream concern. I think that's because of us, and much more importantly, in the coming years, hundreds of thousands of people will be helped who wouldn't be helped without us. Duncan Brack.
Thank you. What are you most pleased to have stopped the Tories doing?
Well, there are lots of, the thing that Vince mentioned, I love Vince's phrase, that the Conservatives have got an inbuilt prejudice against workers, shirkers and burkers. It's, I hope you don't mind me using that on the doorstep, Vince. I think it's fantastic. But the thing that Vince mentioned, this measure they wanted to introduce to basically fire people with no reason given, is a very good example. Their wish to basically start telling teachers and nurses here in Liverpool they're going to be paid less than teachers and nurses elsewhere. We stopped that. But I think the main thing is if you listen to George Osborne's speech last autumn at their party conference, he spelt out loud and clear, there was absolutely no ambiguity about it, about the kind of macroeconomic policy that the Conservatives want to pursue on their own. And yes, it's radical, but it's also deeply regressive and unfair. It's, as Vince quite rightly pointed out, it's an extraordinarily hardline ideological assertion that only the working age poor should pick up the tab or make any further sacrifices to balance the books. They have to pick up the tab for the mistakes of the bankers. They say that they want to deprive us of the ability, as Vince has explained, to mobilize the kind of the financial clout of the state to invest in road, rail, housing, in national infrastructure because of a dogmatic antagonism to thinking creatively about how you can use the financial muscle of the state to renew our infrastructure. And they want to cut billions and billions and billions more from public services than is economically necessary, even after the deficit has been dealt with. And that is what we have stopped. They would have done that over the last half a decade. They would have done that, and we would have been economically poorer, and we would have been socially much, much more divided, and we stopped that.
Thank you. We'll move on to the next question we've had submitted, which is from Hannah Betsworth. Hannah asks, in the light of hunger strikes spreading across detention centres, is it not time to end detention for all asylum seekers and not just children?
So, Hannah, I think it is certainly the time as, we can decide which limit it is, but I think we do need to impose a time limit, as Sarah Tether, in an excellent cross-party report, has suggested recently, that there should be a time limit to the detention of adults for immigration purposes. I agree with that. I think it's been a fantastic achievement that we stopped the truly barbaric behaviour under the Labour government of hundreds, if not thousands, of children, innocent children, being detained, sometimes for very long periods of time, for immigration purposes. We put the end to that. And we certainly need to review the conditions and practices in some of these detention centres. And the Home Office has recently announced that such a review is now going to take place. I don't think it is, however, realistic to imagine that you, under no circumstances ever, detain someone if they do not belong in this country. And here's the thing. An immigration system, and every country has the right to do this, is a system in which a country can decide who is eligible to come into the country and who's not. That's what, immigration is not a free-for-all. It shouldn't be, and it never has been. So that being said, you have to find some means where there are people who identified who've come into the country who don't belong here to get them to go somewhere else, to go back home. And in extremis, and it should be in extremis, that might require, I hope for the shortest period of time possible, a detention before they leave. But I think that is, I'm afraid, a hard reality to the very principle of an immigration system, which is one in which the state reserves the right to say that someone is not entitled to be here. So I don't think it is realistic to say that you have no detention, but I think the conditions within which detention occur, and most especially whether we retain the indefinite power to detain someone, I certainly think that needs to be curtailed. And I think it was our last spring conference where we voted as a party to impose a time limit on adult detention periods for immigration purposes.
Thank you. And I think Hannah's got a supplementary.
Thank you for that. I did actually mean about the limits. It just doesn't sound quite as snappy in a question.
Oh, right.
It's on a slightly related note, about the Azure cards for asylum seekers. They severely limit what they can and can't buy and do because they're only accepted in particular supermarkets. I would think that we need to abolish that and introduce some kind of other support system under Section 95 instead of Section 4. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, look, if the Azure cards are, I mean, I'm not probably as well informed as you are about exactly what their failings are, but if those cards are far from doing what they're supposed to be doing, which is enabling people who are waiting for their asylum application to be processed, for a decision to be arrived at, to nonetheless have the means to feed themselves and heat themselves and so on. If that is not the case, then clearly they're not working and they need to be changed, and we need to review that, and that is absolutely something which we should do.
Okay, great, thanks.
But can I just, sorry, Hannah, so you were agreeing that we should be time limiting the powers?
Yes, I was. It was simply because it sounds better to say end detention than to be like, oh,
honestly, sound bites and grabbing headlines is a very dangerous thing to do. You've got to.
Well, anyway, thank you.
Yeah, that gentleman there.
Simon Foster, Birmingham Yardley. Nick, recently I've been out campaigning with the excellent Layla Moran for Oxford Western Abingdon. Layla's had some brilliant news this week. The appeal for the expansion of Campsfield House has been rejected, and that project will now not go ahead. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I think it was a lot to do with Liberal Democrats locally and nationally. I made it very clear in government that I was not supportive of the expansion of Campsfield either, and did so after, obviously, one of my many visits to on the campaign trail in Oxford Western Abingdon. And I think I don't know, it's difficult to test it scientifically, but I wonder whether that decision would have been arrived at without Liberal Democrats representing local people as faithfully and as effectively as we have done. So that's another campaigning victory for Layla Moran on path to becoming MP for Oxford Western Abingdon, I think. Yeah. Yep, down here.
Thank you. Stephen Kenny, Tiverton and Honiton. As part of our Fairer Society and Stronger Economy debate this morning, the manifesto debate, conference voted to replace the Independent Living Fund. That's a fund that protects the most vulnerable and supports disabled people in communities. I'm wondering, now that conference has voted in that way, is there anything that you can do as Deputy Prime Minister in the next 2 weeks to save this crucible of empowerment for the most vulnerable in our country and make our country a fairer society?
I think your faith in the speed with which conference motions are translated into government policy is probably a little optimistic, particularly when everybody's out on the campaign trail. But I think it's obviously right that as a party we've identified what's happening to the Independent Living Fund and the reforms we've advocated. I'm not going to pretend that I think we can change all of that. I mean, look, we've got a budget on Wednesday, which Danny and I have been working on a lot, obviously in endless discussion with George Osborne and David Cameron over the last several weeks. That's now we pretty well finalised it yesterday in internal discussions. That's in effect the last act of significant decision making by this coalition government. So anyway, next time, I think is the answer. Anyone else on that? Yep, back there. Oh, you're going to have to run all the way around now. Yeah.
I was actually going to ask something else, so I don't know if I can. Yeah.
Yeah, sure, I don't mind.
Sorry, Ed Kearns, we met recently on the Next Generation course. Cambridgeshire County Council is reviewing its future, as are a lot of councils, about how it continues to deliver public services. What advice would you give Cambridgeshire County Council in looking at how it can continue to deliver services, or other councils facing an uncertain future?
Well, I think the first thing is don't vote Conservative, because, no, seriously, of course there are going to be savings. There are going to have to be further savings. About a quarter of total government expenditure goes through local authorities. As you know, under our fiscal plans, we've got 2 or 3 more years of savings to be made. But we're taking a very sensible, balanced approach, saying that tax does play a role. Of course it does. But it needs to be administered fairly, so we're going to ask a bit of extra money through the taxation system from those with the broadest shoulders, as, by the way, we have done during this government to finish the job. So does tax avoidance. So does, yes, some savings in the welfare budget as well, though on a much, much smaller scale than envisaged by the Conservatives, and also some savings, ongoing savings in Whitehall, and that, of course, will affect local authorities. So it's not will further savings need to be made, it's how long. Under our plan, it's another 2 or 3 years to go. Labour's plan, ironically, by the way, is, I mean, they want to pull the plaster off much, much more slowly, if I can put it that way. They're actually going to preside over a longer period in time, a longer period of time of cuts for local authorities and other areas of public spending than we are, because they just won't commit to finishing the job and finishing on time. But crucially, if you do what the Conservatives do, I think their plans are, socially regressive for the reasons that I explained to Duncan earlier, but I think they are totally and utterly unworkable as far as what they will ask local government. They will completely decimate already a very, very overstretched and overstrained social care system. So my first advice would be to everybody in Cambridge, if you care about the ability of local councils to deliver particularly statutory duties like social care, don't vote Conservative. And then I think there's in a sense, a much more complex argument about how we can make sure that all these different silos of money that we've got, that often I think mean that we kind of duplicate expenditure, most notoriously the way in which we have NHS spending and social care spending in 2 different silos. I think I'm absolutely convinced we could be so much more effective at providing local services more effectively if we only allowed those budgets to be spent in a much more sensible way than is presently the case, because of the balkanised way in which Whitehall slices up the cake. So there you go. Don't vote Conservatives and stop balkanisation of Whitehall. Anybody else? Yes, gentleman there.
Hey, Nick, you know me quite well.
Yes.
I'm the one that ambushes you every year. So this time I would like to say in front of every single member how proud we are that you are our leader.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And I believe you...
I didn't arrange this before.
I don't believe that you hear this often enough. Secondly, the question that I have is about NHS. We have our hospitals that are struggling, and the problem that we have is that our hospital doctors work in the private hospitals and in NHS. What plans do you have to eradicate this horrible state that we find ourselves, where doctors working in the NHS drove patients to private hospitals, and then private hospitals, when they make cock-ups, NHS fits the bill?
Sure. I mean, look, can I just first thing just about this whole issue, because we hear this constantly from the Labour Party that somehow, we've presided over a greater share of private sector work in the NHS. It is just rubbish. When we came into power, I think, was it 4 or 5% of total NHS spending was devoted to, it was about 4% maybe, to 4 or 5% through the private sector. It's now 6%. It's gone up by about 1 or 2%. But actually the vast bulk of the money that, and it's a small fraction of the total, that goes through the private sector happened under Labour. And of course it was Labour that introduced these independent treatment centres, the ITCs, do you remember, which were deliberately set up to undercut the NHS, which were given a tariff, a rigged tariff, by Labour's Department of Health to undercut the NHS. It's astonishing. They spent £250 million, £250 million of your money on botched private sector contracts, the Labour Party did, which didn't help a single NHS patient. And they have the gall to lecture us about privatisation of the NHS. It's shocking hypocrisy. I mean, my own view, for what it's worth, is I don't actually think the fact that doctors, as they always have done, by the way, and of course doctors have always been self-employed. They're not, doctors are not, in one sense, state employees. Doctors have always been self-employed, private sector employees, in a sense. So I don't think that's where the huge crunch point seems to be emerging in the NHS at the moment. Part of it is the reason that I was alluding to earlier, this dysfunction between social care and healthcare. We'll all of you, I bet, know of some elderly friend or neighbour or resident who ends up in a hospital bed, is clinically judged, ready to be discharged, to go back home or go back into the community, but because the NHS and the social care don't sort of talk to each other properly, there's nowhere for them to go. And that's becoming a real problem in the NHS. I think that's more important. I think the phenomenon of an ageing population, we in effect, let's be candid, live in a society which is very different to the society for which the NHS was originally designed. And because we have an aging population, great, people are living longer, and we have more and more people who live with long-term conditions related to aging, what we're doing is we're just decanting people in ever larger numbers into our hospitals. It's very expensive, doesn't actually make them better, and it's not really the kind of NHS you would design from scratch, if you like, for the kind of aging society we now live in. And that's why integrating mental health and physical health, integrating social care and health care, making sure that we keep people as much as we can well in their own home, in their own community, rather than putting them onto a conveyor belt into hospital. That seems to me to be absolutely essential if we want to have the kind of NHS that we cherish and love for the future, plus, of course, giving it the money that it needs, which is why it's great that we're the only party to have a plan to provide the NHS with the £8 billion extra it needs per year by the end of the next Parliament, as estimated by the head of NHS England, Simon Stevens.
Thank you. I think we're going to move on to the next question. This is from Nick Thornsby. It is party policy to support the transatlantic trade and investment partnership. How would you convince those sceptical about TTIP and its benefits to support it?
So, look, on this TTIP thing, this transatlantic trade agreement, firstly, the thing that has, and we had some protesters outside handing out leaflets about the purported effect of TTIP on the NHS. Let's be very clear. The person in Brussels responsible for negotiating this agreement on our behalf, she happens to be an old friend of mine. I used to be a fellow MEP with her, Cecilia Malmström, very nice Swedish liberal, has written a letter to Vince. Vince has spoken to her, I have spoken to her, saying in terms there is absolutely nothing in that agreement that could ever force a British government to outsource or privatise any of our NHS. And more than that, there is absolutely nothing in that agreement that could force this government or any future government to return any outsourced part of the NHS back into public ownership. And, I think, have we published the letter, Vince? Yeah, we've published the letter. It's probably on the BIS website. Please look at it. It could not be more categorical. That's the first thing on the NHS. Second thing is, it will just help our economy to grow. The estimates vary from everything between £4 billion and £10 billion of extra money accruing to the British economy, but I don't think we should sniff at that. But then there's a big, we'll turn our noses up at that, but then I think there's a big, slightly more geostrategic, if I can be rather sort of grand about it, reason. Look, if I think about the world that my kids are going to, they're 13, 10 and 6 right now, that they're going to inhabit, I would rather that they don't necessarily live in a Britain where all the standards, all the technical standards, all the trade standards, all the rules by which we work in a globalized world are all set in Beijing, Latin America, and other side of the world. I would like to think that the old world, on either side of the Atlantic, that we can still get together and use our clout to set some of the rules of the game ourselves. Because power is shifting dramatically from the old world to the new world, from the west to the east. And I just think if we're not careful, our concerns about some of the details, and in my view, some of the misplaced concerns about the details of TTIP, might unwittingly mean that we don't enter into that agreement, and before you know it, in 20, 30, 40 years' time, all the rules of the game are, never mind Brussels, London, or Washington, are set by people who are not malign necessarily, but over whom we certainly have absolutely no influence and control whatsoever. So if you want to set the rules of the game for the future, I think it is very important that we complete this agreement, of course, though, on a very fair basis and on a fair deal.
Thank you. Nick has got a
the emails they get from 38 Degrees. Well, no, I just think as a party with a proud heritage of supporting both free trade and the European Union, we should be absolutely vocally supportive of TTIP, given the benefits you've set out.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a difficult one in the sense that globalization generally has brought a lot of unease. Understandably, globalization, unsettles and creates huge kind of churn and displacement in our world, and it makes people feel anxious. I understand that. But ironically enough, turning our backs, in my view, against agreements like this makes us more rather than less sort of vulnerable to the forces of globalization, the future of which we'll have no control. And that's why I think, on the NHS, I don't think that the concerns, as I say, are and could not be now have allayed in more crystal clear terms than by Cecilia Malmström in the letter that Vince asked her to write, but also because I just kind of think it would be a bit of an own goal for us as a country, and certainly for us as an internationalist party, thinking about the future, thinking about the kind of world we'll inhabit years ahead, if we were to start kind of turning inwards. There's just no future for our country turning inwards. There just isn't. We have to remain an outward-looking country.
Thank you. I think we'll take one supplement. If we take one other question on TTIP.
Yep, chap in the suit there. Yep.
Conference, Nick, thanks for this opportunity. It's not on TTIP, but I've got an urgent question that I need to ask you, Nick. It's about Hong Kong. 100 years ago, my grandfather worked for the East India Company, and 100 years later, it's my first time here in Liverpool attending the best conference ever. So thank you very much, everyone. Labour and the Tory government has turned their backs on Hong Kong. Our representative there in Hong Kong published a 6-monthly report, which is completely trash. I know you have met with activists from Hong Kong.
Yep.
Will you turn your back on Hong Kong? I mean, the issue is quite urgent, and it is an international contract between China and the United Kingdom on the joint declaration. If China can turn their back on such issue, then future contract between China and the UK, they can turn their back too.
No, we won't. The Liberal Democrats will not turn our backs on Hong Kong or ignore the provisions of the joint declaration and the basic law, which of course was presided over by Conservatives. I remember John Major quite rightly solemnly saying on our behalf as a country at the time, when Chris Patten was the departing governor, that we would stick by the terms of it. And as you know better than I suspect any of us here, the argument is about, and you're right, I've met An Sung Chang and others quite recently about this. The argument is the joint declaration envisages a move towards universal suffrage for the election of Hong Kong's chief executive. But the interpretation of universal suffrage or universal mandate imposed by Beijing is not what anyone here would commonly understand universal suffrage to mean, because they're basically saying that those who can choose the candidates to stand in the election for the chief executive are not the people. It's a sort of partial election. It's a sort of selectorate that is used, and that is why I've been very outspoken, much more than anyone else in government, and I'm not going to hide my frustration. And I think the somewhat sort of mealy-mouthed response from other parts of government to say, look, hang on a minute, we made a very solemn commitment at the time, the United Kingdom did, that we wouldn't stand idly by if the terms of the handover of Hong Kong to Chinese sovereignty was going to be rewritten, and they're being rewritten in a way that we don't think conforms to the principles of democracy that we believe in, and to the principles of one country, two systems, which underpins the whole agreement in the first place. So good luck to you.
Thank you. I think we've got time just for one more question that's been submitted. Unfortunately, there won't be time for a supplementary on it. It's from Jill Hope from South Northamptonshire. It's, if UKIP and the SNP are now the parties of protest, and the Greens are the party for young people...
Oh, no.
Sorry, I'm not meant to interrupt the chair. In 2015, what are the Liberal Democrats for?
Well, I can see you there, Jill. I mean, I just don't agree with you. I don't agree that it's flattering the SNP and UKIP to say they're the party of protest. They're the party of division. They're not the party of protest. They're the parties of finger-pointing, blame, of grievance, of dividing people one against each other. That's not a. I mean, you know, there's a role for the politics of protest. I think it's an ugly form of the sort of politics of grievance, and I certainly don't accept that the Greens represent a kind of youthful vision of what this country is about. They're not the party that presided over the biggest expansion of apprenticeships in a generation. They're not the party to be delivering the pupil premium. They're not the party that have now presided over seeing a lower number of young people in out of work than when we came into the office. They're not the party that's introducing, healthy free school meals for small children at school. I mean, I just think, of course, by moving from opposition into government, of course we've lost the support of those people who might not like any party that ever has anything to do with government. Of course I get that. And of course we've taken a whole lot of decisions, most notably on higher education, that have meant that some young people now are much less inclined to vote for us than before. But it doesn't mean that the only antidote to that, it's the same answer to the question posed earlier, is not to sort of try and kind of reinforce those criticisms of us, or worse still, the slightly self-aggrandizing claims of the other parties, is to proudly and loudly say that without us, this country wouldn't be anchored in the centre ground. Without us, there wouldn't be a sense of opportunity for us, for young people. Without us, there wouldn't be an economic recovery. Without us, there wouldn't be tax cuts. And without us, there wouldn't be a whole, happy and open United Kingdom.
I think that's a very good note to end this session on. Thank you very much for putting yourself and allowing yourself to be questioned on a whole range of issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you.